travel as much as that. And there were about 15 associate editors, so it wasn't that glorious a title, actually.
And how did you end up as an associate editor at Playboy?
Well, I was working for an imitation of Playboy called Jaguar. And the publisher told me to make it more like Playboy, and I made it more like Playboy, and he fired me because he couldn't understand it. Which is to say, I made it a magazine for college graduates, yuppies as they call nowadays, the upwardly mobile young males of the 60s. And I got another job on one of those tabloid newspapers. And while I was working at that job, I wrote an article about my experience putting out this imitation Playboy. And it was called Confessions of a Schlockmeister by Anonymous Hack. And it was published in The Realist. And one of the editors of Playboy read it and contacted the editor of The Realist, and I was called in for an interview. And then they sent me back to New York and sent me to a psychologist for a day of tests. That was right after Spektorsky took over as editorial director of Playboy. And Spektorsky was a big fan of psychological testing. So I went through all these tests. I had a barrel of fun with them because I was also being considered for a job as an editor of a social science journal in St. Louis. And I didn't see any reason to try to fool the psychologist anyway. I just let it rip. So I know one of the thematic apperception cards is a guy on a table who may be in pain or may be laughing, depends on what you want to project into it, with two guys leaning over him with what may be knives or maybe scalpels or maybe something else, depending on, and a guy looking in front of them, looking right out at you, who seems to have all of the standard characteristics we attribute to gay men. And you're supposed to project into that. So I projected into it. This is a scene from a horror movie. One of the actors has just blown his lines. The guy on the table is a survivor of a Nazi concentration camp, is thinking ironic thoughts about the public's appetite for artificial horrors in a world so full of real horrors. The gay guy up front is thinking the director is a pain in the ass. I don't know what they made of that, but I answered them all that way. I just let my imagination rip, you know, and my sardonic sense of humor. I also took an IQ test, which had very interesting results. When I was talking to the psychologist after all the tests were over, I said, "How did I do on the IQ?" And he said, "I'm not going to tell you. You're too conceited already." I've always thought of myself as a very modest person. Something must have come out in those tests that showed a great deal of vanity that I never like to acknowledge. So I don't know how high my IQ is, but I know it's pretty high.
So you took those tests as a part of getting hired at Playboy?
That's right, yeah. And I went directly to work for the Playboy Forum, even though they originally thought of hiring me to write the Playmate of the Month copy. But I had lunch with the guy who was editing the Playboy Forum. He decided I would just write for that department. The Playboy Forum was letters from readers about civil liberties issues together with Playboy's responses. I wrote most of Playboy's responses while I was there. Of course, they all had to be approved by Hefner. He would read the galleys of the whole damn magazine between midnight and 6 in the morning. And we'd come back covered with blue corrections of all sorts, some of them running longer than the original text. But he hardly ever changed any of my copy. It seems, although we're very different types of human beings, Hefner and I think very much alike about political issues. Get the government off our backs. The less government, the better. Very Jeffersonian.
So during those years, what was the Playboy Forum like?
Well, I think we were the first mass magazine. There were a lot of radical little magazines in the 60s, you know. We were the first mass magazine to come out for legalizing marijuana. We were the first one to oppose the war in Vietnam among the mass magazines. We were the first to support legalizing abortion. We were the first to support gay rights. We were the first to support almost everything that's still controversial, even 30 years later, but less controversial than it was in the 60s. And I was real happy. I was writing my own opinions and getting the highest salary I ever earned in all of my business career. And then the feminists came along and told me I was a male chauvinist pig for working for Hefner. And I thought, what the hell is this? I got a job that I enjoy doing where I'm writing what I really think I'm getting the biggest salary. Now they're trying to lay a guilt trip on me for it. I haven't liked feminists much since then, even though my wife was a feminist, but she felt that we needed the money, so she didn't object to my working for Play. She wasn't that kind of feminist anyway.
Why do you think that job stands out in people's minds as so prestigious?
I think there's a vast mythology about orgies at the Playboy Mansion. They imagine if you work there, you must have had orgies with with several playmates of the month at once.
So can you describe for listeners one of these orgies you attended?
I never attended an orgy in the Playboy Mansion. I wasn't invited. If they were having orgies, they didn't invite me.
So how long did you work for Playboy?
About 6 years, a little less than 6 years.
But it was wasn't it during that time that you began working on your writing career as such?
Well, I'd always been writing. I've been published in dozens of magazines. One of the rules they had at Playboy was if you were a Playboy editor, you couldn't publish in another magazine under your own name without getting Spektorsky's approval, so that you wouldn't reflect unfavorably on Playboy's image. But they left that deliberate loophole under your own name, so you could write anything you want for any other magazine as long as it wasn't under the name that appeared on Playboy's masthead. So I invented about 7 pen names and was writing for all the underground newspapers of the 60s. There's where I was putting the opinions that were too radical for the Playboy Forum. Like our presidents have been a series of serial killers.
When was your first book published?
That's fascinating. You asked me when my first book was published, and I can't remember. It was either 72 or 73. Yeah, either 72 or I can remember when my first article was published. That was 1959. In 1959, I sold 2 articles on my birthday. One to the James Joyce Review. It was called Joyce and Taoism, and one to the Realist, which it was called The Semantics of God. The Semantics of God asks the question, does God have a penis? Which has become a hot topic in the last couple of decades. I think I was the first one to raise the issue. I asked, is God a he, a she, or an it, and came down in favor of it. As you might guess by the fact I also wrote an article about Joyce and Taoism at the same time. I'm very much into Taoism. I can conceive of a principle of organization within the universe that makes things work out in a certain way, but I can't conceive of a personality. The idea that there's a character, especially a character like Yahweh in the Old Testament, I just can't believe he had anything to do with, if he existed at all, he couldn't create the universe. He couldn't even create a DNA molecule. He'd get about 2 strands right, then he'd get the 3rd one wrong, then he'd go into a tiff and blow up 3 cities and drop fire and brimstone on 4 more and tell the Hebrews to go slaughter another tribe. I mean, he's at a 4-year-old level of mental development, and this is supposed to be the mind behind the universe. That's like asking me to believe that the 3 Stooges created the universe.
And what was the first book that came out in 72 or 3?
Playboy's Book of Forbidden Words. Which I am currently rewriting since the rights have reverted to me under the title Black Magic and Curses. And it's written from a more anthropological standpoint than the original. But it's mostly the same material, but it's with a more scholarly and anthropological way of looking at it. Perhaps, sometimes I don't know whether I'm writing social science or social satire. Sometimes it's